Hey guys, how's it going? So for this video, it would be an understatement to say that I am extremely excited to discuss and analyze the 7th episode of Season 4 of Better Call Saul, entitled Something Stupid. This was an absolutely amazing episode that contained a great number of callbacks and references to the plot of Breaking Bad, which also, as was indicated would occur in the promo trailer for this episode, contained a rather significant advancement in the timeline as well. So without further delay, let's jump right into this review for episode 7. Okay, so the cold opening scene of this episode presented us with the first major significant advancement in the timeline to occur over the entire course of Better Call Saul in the form of a montage scene which, based on the plot and dialogue of this episode, ended up taking place over the course of 9 months. So during this flash forward montage scene, we saw Jimmy and Kim over the course of these months going about their daily routines and starting up their new separate respective lives, which displayed Kim starting her new life at Schweigert & Coakley and Jimmy starting his full-time business of reselling burner phones with his newly hired backup and protection Huell, which very interestingly ended up foreshadowing the plot of Jimmy and Kim that would transpire at the very end of this episode. So with these plot details about this opening scene being taken into account, the very pertinent question remains of why the creators of Better Call Saul felt the need to add this advancement in the timeline to the plot of Season 4. That being said, as I discussed in depth in my previous video, at the current pace the timeline was progressing this season, it appeared that without this utilization of this time lapse, that not only Season 4, but also Season 5 of Better Call Saul would be entirely devoted to the plot of Jimmy McGill during his PPD and legal suspension, and would not be able to encompass Jimmy starting up the law offices of Saul Goodman and Associates. Additionally, also relating to this timeline advancement, due to the fact that over the course of the first 6 episodes of Better Call Saul this season, the relationship between Jimmy and Kim was still rather well intact, I think it would have seemed rather abrupt and implausible if this relationship ended suddenly at the end of this season without the several-month advancement in the timeline that occurred at the beginning of this episode. Furthermore, due to the fact that the 2 main plots involving Gus Fring also need a significant amount of time to elapse in order to get to the point where they were when we first saw them in the plot of Breaking Bad, i.e. the plot of Hector's recovery as well as the construction of the super lab, without this time lapse, the remaining episodes of Better Call Saul would also only seemingly be able to tackle the distant backstory of these plots as well. And finally, with this possible explanation for this time lapse being taken into account, I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that at the end of this opening scene, we saw Kim fade to black next to Jimmy, which most certainly appeared to be foreshadowing the end of this relationship in the near future in the plot of Better Call Saul this season. So, following this cold opening scene, the first scene of Act 1 then displayed Jimmy showing an office space to a person out of frame, who at the end of this scene was revealed to be none other than Huell. And with that being said, following the time lapse that occurred at the beginning of this episode, and there now only being 1 month until Jimmy's legal suspension is completed, it appears that we saw Jimmy in this scene look at an office space to use for a criminal law practice, ideally in order to represent many of the people who were and will be arrested who also bought these burner phones from him. Additionally, while it appeared that this office space was not the location that will end up being used for the law offices of Saul Goodman and Associates, it nonetheless appears that the primary reason that this scene was added into the plot of this episode was in order to foreshadow the plot of Huell, which very interestingly seemingly set in motion the explanation for why Huell did not appear in the plot of Breaking Bad until the first episode of Season 4. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 1 then cut to the scene that was teased to us prior to this episode of a now lucid and awake Hector Salamanca following this time-lapse montage that occurred during this opening scene, where we saw Hector going through some physical therapy in order to regain his cognitive functions following his stroke. That being said, while this scene on the surface did not appear to be that significant, in the end, however, this scene would end up foreshadowing the plot of Gus Fring in this episode, which would provide us with a major plot detail regarding the backstory of Gus and Hector prior to us learning about their personal history in the plot of Breaking Bad. Following this scene, the third and final scene of Act 1 then presented us with a scene of Jimmy and Kim at Schweigert & Coakley at an office party. During this scene, we saw a very uniquely charming Jimmy meet many of Kim's colleagues at Schweigert & Coakley, which ended up leading to a very intriguing and somewhat enigmatic interaction between Jimmy and Rich Schweigert, where we saw a very animated Jimmy discuss with Rich the details regarding a Schweigert & Coakley company retreat in a manner that could be interpreted as over-the-top and somewhat condescending. So, taking that into account, while I think there are many different possible interpretations to this rather peculiar scene, in my opinion, I think the brief scene of Jimmy walking into Kim's office prior to this interaction with Rich and seeing all of the accolades of Schweigert & Coakley ended up really upsetting Jimmy due to the fact that he saw this prestigious law firm as the reason for why his dreams of starting up Wexler & McGill again following the termination of his PPD would never occur. And with all of that being taken into account, I think that Kim's reaction to Jimmy at the end of this scene displayed to us yet another proverbial crack in the foundation of this relationship as it seemingly nears its necessary end this season as per the plot of Breaking Bad. Following Act 1, Act 2 of this episode then picked up with another montage scene involving the plot of the German workers and their construction on the super lab, where we got to see the process that was involved in the transportation of these men to and from the warehouse to work on the construction of the super lab via a van for the industrial laundry, which following this montage scene of 9 months, we can now see is up and running. That being said, as per the theme of this episode of a time jump, it appears that this scene was added in the plot of Better Call Saul in this episode to show the somewhat significant progress that has been made during the construction on the super lab, that at the same time as we would also see in this episode, still has a very long way to go. Furthermore, as a very cool side note, this scene where we got to see how the German workers were transported to the industrial laundry in order to work on the construction of the super lab really in many ways reminded me of Walter White's first day on the job at the super lab as well, in regards to his process of going about his business while all of the workers at the laundry did not pay attention to him. And that being taken into account, speaking for myself, this scene also reminded me about the fact that during this whole entire run of Better Call Saul, Walter White is somewhere out there in Albuquerque, and in a few years from now will end up taking part in this plot as well. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 2 then presented us with a scene of Gus and the doctor from Johns Hopkins, Maureen Bruckner, who is rehabilitating Hector at the home of Gus Fring, which like many scenes in this episode was also a direct reference to the plot of Breaking Bad, where in a very similar fashion to Walt and Jesse, Gus invited her over to his home and even served the same Chilean dish, paella marina, in order to discuss the progress of Hector's medical condition. So, during this scene, we saw Dr. Bruckner tell Gus about the very significant progress that has been made by Hector over the several months since he woke from his coma. However, nonetheless, upon hearing about this progress, Gus then proceeded to press Dr. Bruckner regarding the question of if Hector will ever truly be the same person he was before his stroke. So, following this, in order to display to Gus some additional evidence of Hector's progress, Dr. Bruckner even showed him a tape of the same session that was displayed to us in Act 1. And upon watching this tape, Gus then discovered via Hector knocking over his cup of water that Hector was in fact cognizant and the same Hector as before. And now, following this realization by Gus, he then insisted to Dr. Bruckner that she end his medical treatment of Hector, which was of course met with much confusion by her, who stated to Gus that with the proper treatment, it could be hypothetically possible Hector will regain his ability to speak, and even possibly his ability to walk again. So with this fact being taken into account, in my opinion, what was incredibly revealing about this scene is that we now know that Hector could have potentially regained all of his mental faculties as well as physical abilities following his stroke, but in the end stayed in the condition he is currently in due to the fact that Gus intervened in his medical care as a part of his sadistic plot where he made Hector well again, but only to a certain extent, so that while he would be lucid, he would still be confined to the state he was in the plot of Breaking Bad, which would give Gus the upper hand in effectively torturing him in retaliation for what he did to Max, which also very interestingly echoed the story that Gus told to the unconscious Hector regarding the coati and the fruit tree from his youth in the previous episode. So following this scene, the third scene in Act 2 then picked up with the construction of the super lab with Mike and Werner overseeing the project. That being said, while like the previous scene of the super lab, it appears that this scene was also presented to us in this episode to show that while some progress has been made on the super lab, there is still nonetheless a very long way that still needs to go until this project will be completed, which based on the plot of Breaking Bad, we know will be the case. Moreover, along with this fact, this scene also presented us with a minor mishap on the construction, which ended up setting back this project even further, and also ended up displaying the frustrated state of the German workers, that would be discussed by Mike and Werner later in this episode. Following this scene, the fourth and final scene of Act 2 then presented us with Jimmy back on the street selling burner phones, where following another sale, he was then approached by a plainclothes police officer who asked Jimmy about why he is selling these phones to people that he knows are using them for felonious purposes, and then told Jimmy to no longer sell these phones to these type of people. Following Jimmy pleading plausible deniability to these charges and then stating that his work is all above board and legal, including the fact that he has a permit and is paying taxes on his sales, he then went on to outright say he would not oblige this officer's request which ended up leading to a heated exchange between the two of them. Following this exchange, we then saw Huell returning to Jimmy following getting some lunch while wearing headphones so that he could not hear what was being stated by Jimmy during this verbal confrontation with this officer, who Huell then mistook as a customer hassling Jimmy and then proceeded to strike him over the head with a bag of sandwiches and soda. So, while the aftermath of this scene would pick up again at the beginning of Act 3, as a very cool side note, this scene also presented us with a subtle plot detail when it displayed another iteration of Jimmy checking his hair and noticing that he's beginning to experience some hair loss, which we interestingly first saw him do in the plot of Better Call Saul this season in the episode entitled Breathe, prior to his meeting at an F Copiers. So, that being stated, I just wanted to point out this detail as another great example of the attention to detail by the creators of Better Call Saul due to the fact that Saul Goodman had a noticeably less amount of hair in the plot of Breaking Bad, and Gene Takovic will eventually experience male pattern baldness in Omaha. So, going back to the main plot of this episode, following the end of Act 2, the first scene in Act 3 then picked up with Huell being arrested and charged with battery on a police officer. While Jimmy tried to talk this officer out of arresting Huell, the officer in the end did not budge, likely due to the attitude that Jimmy displayed towards him, as well as the fact that Huell was a prior offender who was previously arrested for pickpocketing, which of course, as we all know, is a direct reference to the plot of Huell in Breaking Bad. That being said, Huell being arrested in this scene would end up foreshadowing the plot of Jimmy and Kim at the end of this episode that would also directly lead to Jimmy having to tell Kim the details regarding his somewhat questionable line of work as well. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 3 then presented us with the German workers back at the warehouse unwinding after work, where we also saw Mike and Werner have a drink together and discuss the details about the construction on the super lab, to which Werner stated to him that there will be some more delays, which he apologizes for and would be willing to explain to Gus, which was then met by Mike stating to him not to worry about this due to the fact that time appears to be no issue for Gus and doing this job right and in total secrecy are really the only main concerns. Additionally, during this conversation, we also saw Mike inquire to Werner about the potential of sending Kai back to Germany. However, upon hearing this request, Werner stated that this would not be possible due to the fact that Kai is his best demolition man, and based on the dialogue of this episode, we know that another significant demolition still needs to occur during the construction process on the super lab. Furthermore, also during this scene, we saw Werner state to Mike that the workers are beginning to become restless due to the fact that they thought this project would only last 8 months, which as we can see is nowhere near being completed following this almost 10-month time lapse that occurred during this opening scene of this episode, which of course is also exacerbated by the fact that during this process, they have not been able to go anywhere outside of work and this warehouse due to the secrecy nature of this project. So with all of these details about this plot being taken into account, due to the teaser that has been displayed to us for the next episode, it appears that this plot involving the German workers in this episode has foreshadowed Mike letting his crew unwind following all of the work that they have already put in so far on the super lab in the next episode of Better Call Saul. Following this scene, the third scene in Act 3 then picked up with Huell at the courthouse, where we learn that he is looking at potentially serving a 2.5-year prison sentence for his battery on a police officer. Following learning about this, Huell then stated his intention to Jimmy to skip bail, to which Jimmy states to not do and to just face the music, as skipping town and having an active warrant would only make matters worse. Following Huell not buying Jimmy's logic and stating that he has no intention of willingly going to prison, Jimmy then stated to him that he would try to get him out of the situation, which would then directly lead to the third scene in this act of Jimmy visiting Kim at Schweigert and Coakley and discussing the details about this case with her. So, during this third scene, we then saw Jimmy at Kim's office, where he stated to her the details regarding Huell's case, which also, of course, led Jimmy to have to tell Kim about the details of him selling burner phones without her knowledge, which we could see in this scene appeared to absolutely blindside her. Furthermore, during this scene, we also heard Jimmy state to Kim the past history of this officer who arrested Huell of getting a DUI and the fact that he had been put on desk duty 2 times, and then proceeded to state to Kim an elaborate plan involving causing this officer to lose his cool in court, which in many ways seemed just like a scheme that Saul Goodman would pull to get a client of his out of a tough spot in the plot of Breaking Bad, which we could also see seemed to even further trouble as well as anger Kim. However, even after all of this, in the end, Kim nonetheless agreed to help Huell, despite the fact that we could see that she seemed to be beyond upset with Jimmy and even proceeded to close the door on him as he left her office. And taking all these details about this plot into account, I think that while Kim is truly upset with Jimmy here in this scene for obvious reasons, she still in the end agreed to help Huell in the same fashion as she would for any other of her pro bono PD cases, and in the end she did not do this to directly help Jimmy. Following the end of Act 3, the fourth act of this episode would then display the final scene of this episode as well, where we would see Kim discuss the details of Huell's case with a DA, who we actually first saw in the plot of Season 2 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Inflatable, during the plot where Jimmy represented Mike in the aftermath of Mike's plot with Tuco. So, during this scene, we saw Kim try to finesse this DA into getting Huell a shorter sentence due to the precedent of the past sentences for other crimes similar to Huell's. However, this effort notwithstanding, this DA appeared to be rather beside herself by this argument by Kim due to the fact that Huell has a prior history and the only other person to witness him assaulting this officer was a scumbag disbarred lawyer, thus implying that there was really no way a judge or a jury would ever take her side on this. So that being said, while we definitely saw that this description of Jimmy as a scumbag lawyer seemed to have another profound impact on Kim, this scene would then nonetheless lead to Kim telling Jimmy that it is unlikely that Huell will be able to avoid any prison time, and then told Jimmy to reinforce to Huell that he needs to man up and do his time and not do anything to make matters worse for himself, which then led Jimmy in a cryptic way to agree with Kim in a manner which made Kim think that he would try to intervene in Huell's case in a very Jimmy McGill-like manner. And following the scene, where we then saw Kim drive to meet with Huell to discuss this case, we then saw Kim appear to have an epiphany of some kind and pull into a store to buy a large assortment of writing utensils and papers, which was then followed by Kim calling Jimmy and stating to him to not do whatever he implied to her that he would do to intervene in Huell's case, and then stated to him that she has a better way to help Huell, which was then followed by this scene cutting to black. So, taking this incredible cliffhanger scene to culminate this very compelling episode into account, I'm really at a total loss for what Kim's plan for Huell might be, and why Kim went to this store to buy these materials as well. And that being said, if you have any theories regarding what Kim's plan is in this scene, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below. And with all of these details about this episode being stated, in my opinion, this might have been the most enjoyable episode to watch all season so far, which also really felt like I was watching an episode of Breaking Bad based on the incredible amount of backstory regarding the plot of Breaking Bad that was displayed to us in this episode, including the very surprising plot twist in this episode, which more or less ended up making this episode being primarily devoted to the plot of the backstory of Huell Babineau prior to Breaking Bad that seemingly provided us with the explanation for why Jimmy did not hire Huell as a full-time bodyguard until season 4 of Breaking Bad, despite the fact that he had known him and done business with him for many years in the past prior to the plot of Breaking Bad. And with all of that being taken into account, now following this rather significant time lapse that occurred at the beginning of this episode, I am extremely excited to see what these last 3 episodes of Season 4 have in store for us as it pertains to how all of these plots that have been presented to us over the course of this season will culminate at the end of Season 4. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up, and also don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos where I discuss and analyze the plot of this episode as well as the plot of the remaining 3 episodes of Season 4. As always, my name is Anton Jackson, thanks again for watching, and thank you so much for supporting this channel.